all those of you who are finishing, I want to say congratulations. It's an amazing accomplishment. And if you haven't yet finished, or you're not even planning to finish, you should feel good about every daf that you learn, because everything that you learn is important. And even if you don't finish, the goal of Daf Yomi, even though it seems like the goal is to finish, it's really to be engaged in the learning. And that's the most important part. With that, we're going to start the learning the last daf together. And I just want to add that our learning should be for Refuah Shlema for two people, two very special people in our community. One is, it's a husband and wife, and the wife tomorrow morning is donating a kidney to her husband. So Refuah Shlema for Elchanan David ben Yatzarut and Tzipora bat Charna. It may all go well tomorrow. We're going to start on Daf Kuf Nun Zayin from the Mishnah, Mithirim Nidarim b'Shabbat v'nishalim l'nidarim shehem l'tzorech HaShabbat. Before we start, I want to explain what Mithirim Nidarim are and what Nishalim l'nidarim are. Mithirim Nidarim is that a husband can cancel the vows of his wife, or a father can cancel the vows of her daughter. Now you might think, what's that all about? And why, as a woman, she makes a vow, her husband can just come along and cancel it, or her father can just come along and cancel it. And it seems a little bit strange, certainly for our modern eyes. Well, there was a case in the Supreme Court that I want to bring up in the United States called Bradwell versus the state of Illinois, which was in 1872. There was a woman who wanted to become a lawyer. And this was before women who really had become lawyers. And the state, in some places, women were allowed to be lawyers, and other places not. And in the state of Chicago, they would not allow Mrs. Bradwell to be a lawyer. And the decision of the Supreme Court was to uphold the state of Chicago, to deny her from getting a license to practice law. Now, you might say, why is that, right? You might, okay. So one of the reasons they gave was that, and I'll quote it from there, as a married woman, she would be bound neither by her express contracts nor by those implied contracts, which is the policy of law to create between attorney and client. And the reason they were concerned that she wouldn't be able to uphold her contracts were because husbands could cancel the contracts of their wives. And therefore, so now we're talking late 1800s, and in the United States, women also, their contracts, any contract of law that they made, was able to be canceled by their husband. They even asked, what about single women? So why can't single women be lawyers? To, of course, the answer given was, I'm sorry, I said the state of Chicago. I meant the state of Illinois, my mistake. Thank you for correcting me. But the issue was that I was reading something that I took offline. It said state of Chicago. Anyway, the reason they say is that the norm is for women to get married, and women should be married, and therefore we're not going to create a law for exceptions to the rule that we don't actually believe should be. So if you think that in the Gemara way back when, this seems a little bit different than our reality, you can see that even in the United States in the late 1800s, this was the case. So when we talk about husband being able to cancel his wife's vows, it actually makes sense in the context not only of way back then, but even 150 years ago. So with that, we'll get started with our Mishnah. Now, if you notice, there's a little bit of lack of parallelism here. It says that one can nullify vows on Shabbat, and they can nishalim l'nidarim shehem l'tzorech haShabbat. What does that mean? This is something else. This is not a father or a husband nullifying his wife's vows. This is somebody takes a vow and then they regret that they took a vow. So they go to a Talmid Chacham or a Chacham, a wise man, someone who can cancel their vow, and that person is allowed to cancel their vows. You can go in front of a Beit Din, a court. Nowadays, we do this on Erev Rosh Hashanah, and Kol Nidrei, our Tefillah, is based on that. So a husband or a father can nullify a vow on Shabbat of his wife or his daughter. And Nishalim l'nidarim, one can go to a Chacham on Shabbat and say, I want to cancel my vow if it's litzorech haShabbat. Like, for example, somebody says, I don't want to eat. I'm going to vow that I'm not going to eat. And then, of course, it's Shabbat and they want to eat. So they say, okay, so litzorech Shabbat, because you want to eat on Shabbat, we'll allow it. Now, notice that the words litzorech haShabbat didn't appear in the first section. The first section just said you could do this on Shabbat. It doesn't sound like it's limited in any way. The next thing the Mishnah talks about seems totally unconnected. Upokikina tama'ol. You can put a glass or you can any kind of stopper in a window to block the window. Umodidima tamatzlit. You can measure a cloth. If you remember, we've learned about purity and impurity laws, and it has to be a certain measurement in order for it to become impure. It has to be a certain minimum measurement. Umodidim et hamikvah, and you can measure a mikvah on Shabbat to be able to purify things. Umaseh b'yamei aviv shel Rabbi Tzadok ubimei Abba Shaul ben Bitnit. So now we're going to hear about a maaseh that happened in the time of Rabbi Tzadok and in the time of Abba Shaul ben Bitnit. Shepakaku et hamaor b'tapiach. They closed up a window with a shard, with the kashru, not with a shard, with a utensil, with an earthenware utensil. Kashru et hamikeda begemi. They took a shard and they tied it. We're going to see exactly what this is. It's going to be very unclear mission until we get to the Gemara. They took a shard and they tied it with a reed. Now, remember, we learned tying is not permissible on Shabbat. Leida im yesh begigit potach tefach. They wanted to know if the roof had a hole that was the size of a tefach. We're going to have to understand what's going on. We don't really understand the story yet. We'll have to wait till we get to the Gemara. And from this story, potach tefach imlav, whether or not it had it or whether it did or didn't. And from their action, what do we learn? That you can close up a window, you can measure, and because they measured at the size of a tefach, and you can tie on Shabbat. This seems to be things you're not generally allowed to do, so we're going to have to understand what's going on. Before we get to this, okay, you can start looking at your sheet. The sheet has all this charted out. We're now going to have a question on the first part of the Mishnah. And then we're going to have two versions of this question. Ibayalu. So the Gemara asks, Hafara ben litzorech uben shelo litzorech. V'she'ela litzorech in shelo litzorech lo. When we said, and the first thing they're going to question is exactly what we said, that there's a problem with the structure here. The structure seems to say you can do hafarat nidarim, nullifying vows of your wife or your daughter on Shabbat, without saying litzorech Shabbat, for the purpose of Shabbat. And then it says, nishalim lenidarim shehen litzorech haShabbat. You can only cancel your vow to go to an expert who can cancel vows if it's for the purposes of Shabbat. So now they want to know, hafara, can one cancel a vow of his wife or his daughter? Bein litzorech, bein shelo litzorech, whether it's for the purposes of Shabbat or whether it's not. V'she'ela litzorech in, shelo litzorech lo. But she'ela, but to go to a chacham and ask to to cancel your vow, that is only if it's for the purpose of Shabbat. Umishum hachi kapalginu me'adade. Now the Gemara says, and the reason why that would be logical would be, look at the structure of the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, mifirim nidarim b'Shabbat, which means we're kind of taking a break here. And then it says, minishalim l'nidarim shehen l'tzorech haShabbat. If we wanted to say the rules are the same for both, we would have put the word b'Shabbat at the end. We would have said, mifirim nidarim, we can nullify vows, and we can dissolve vows. Shehen l'tzorech haShabbat b'Shabbat. And then that would have been very clear. But since it doesn't say that, it seems to imply that hafara would be either which way, and she'ela would be only for the purposes of Shabbat. And that's why kapalginu me'adade. That's why they were separated in the Mishnah. O Dilma, you can see how much they learn from the wording of the Mishnah. O Dilma, or perhaps hafara nami litzorechin shelo litzorech lo. Maybe hafara, maybe nullifying vows is also only for the purposes of Shabbat. And now obviously he's going to have to explain, well then why did they split the Mishnah? They wanted to make it clear that you understood that these are two different things. One is hafara, one is hashalat. They're not the same, even though you might think to confuse them. One can be done only in front of a court, that's the she'ela, and hafara can be done by any man for his wife or his daughter. So that's the question. Let's see the answer. Tashma, and this is going to be the same in both. The question is going to be different. The answer is going to be the same. Tashma, the Tanezuta, the Bei Rav Papa, they had a braita in the house of Rav Papa. Mifirim nidarim b'Shabbat litzorech Shabbat. So what do you see here? One can nullify vows on Shabbat for the purpose of Shabbat. Litzorech Shabbat in, shelo litzorech Shabbat lo. So you see here, it's very clear, only for the purposes of Shabbat. Lishna achrina, now there's a different way to explain this. So now, of course, the way we're going to read the Mishnah is Mifirim Nidarim b'Shabbat and Nishalim Nidarim Shem L'Tzorach HaShabbat. The only way one can do this is if one's doing it for the purposes of Shabbat. And this is actually going to lead us to the next story, because the next story is also something where they allowed something for the purposes of Shabbat. But the Lishna Achrina has the question a little bit differently, and it gets at a different issue that we didn't get raised about. It teaches us something about nullifying vows. So the question was asked differently now. Litzorech, again, many times we've seen that there's different versions of the same debate. It's just a matter of how exactly did the question come about? How was the debate? Here's a matter of what the question was. The answer, as I said, will be the same. Litzorech atravayu katane, shelo litzorech lo, alma hafarat nidarim me'ed la'ed. Do we say that litzorech refers to both? That when it says shehein litzorech hashabbat, it's referring both to the first part and to the second part, in which case you would say, but if it's not for the purpose of Shabbat, then you can't. And what could one infer from that? Okay, before we move on, I'm just going to clarify something. If I take a vow and I want to cancel that vow and I want to go to a chacham, I can go anytime I want. I make the vow. If I want to go 2 weeks later, I can go cancel it. But now we're going to learn that there was a limitation. And this is interesting in terms of thinking. If I make a vow, my husband can cancel it or my father can cancel it. By the way, it's father until you have a husband. They only get a certain time frame in which they can do it. It's not endless. What the idea is that when they hear the neder, and it comes from the Torah, it says, im shama, I don't remember the verse exactly, but it says when he hears, then he has only a certain amount of time that he can cancel it. We don't let him do it forever. So now they're going to say, if you say that it could be either litzorech, or if it could be only litzorech Shabbat, what does that infer? That the time he has would be more than the day of Shabbat. Assuming he hears on Shabbat, it means that it must be, he has time to do it after. Otherwise, there would be no issue of saying that it's shelo l'tzorech, he can't cancel it. Because if you can't cancel it shelo l'tzorech, and then you won't be able to cancel it ever if there's a time limit. So let's see what the time limit is. Therefore, they're going to say, we're going to learn that there's a debate. One opinion says you only get till nightfall of that day. So assuming she takes the neder on Shabbat, and we say, well, if it's not for the purpose of Shabbat, we don't let him nullify it. Then what happens? If he can't nullify it tomorrow, then there's no such thing as not litzorech Shabbat. It's always going to be litzorech Shabbat. And therefore, they say it must be alma hafarat nidarim me'ed la'ed. You have 24 hours to nullify. So therefore, let's say he hears Shabbat morning. He has till Sunday morning. And that's what we're talking about here, that it's only litzorech Shabbat. And then, if not, well, he could do it tomorrow. O Dilma, or perhaps ki katani litzorech ashelahu de katani. When it says litzorech, maybe it's only referring to the second case of dissolving the vow with a chacham. But ashelahu de katani aval haparat nidarim afilu shelo litzorech. But haparat nidarim can be done, as it looks like the pshat of the Mishnah. There's no limit on it. Now, why? There's no. It doesn't matter whether it's litzorech or shelo litzorech, whether it's something that affects her, let's say eating on Shabbat, or it doesn't affect her Shabbat. So therefore, what it must be, if we say it's that reading, then we can infer what this reading is saying is basically, we want to learn something from this Mishnah about hafarat nidarim in general. And therefore, we can derive that what? Alma hafarat nidarim kol hayom. You must be allowed to have it all day long. So again, the Gemara says, Tashma, this is the same as the first version. Let's learn it from this source. Titane Rav Zuta debe Rav Papi. Mifirin nidarim b'Shabbat litzorech haShabbat. By the way, the first time it was Rav Papa, here it's Rav Papi. You can do it litzorech haShabbat, which seems to infer litzorech haShabbat in shelo litzorech haShabbat lo alma. Therefore, what can one derive from here? Haparat nidarim me'ed la'ed. You have 24 hours. Rav Ashi, but Rav Ashi says, wait a minute. B'hanan tnan haparat nidarim kol hayom v'yesh b'davar lahakel u'lachmir. According to the Mishnah says haparat nidarim kol hayom. And this has a kula and a chumrah. What is the kula and the chumrah? Ketzad. Here it doesn't exactly mean kula and chumrah the way we usually, it has something stringent, something lenient. What it means is could be something that works to your advantage, and it could be something that maybe doesn't always work to your advantage. So what does that mean? This is kind of obvious. If you only have till nightfall, it kind of depends on when you heard about the vow. So Ketzad, Nadra lele Shabbat. Here they actually talk about the moment she took the vow. Nadra, if she took the vow, lele Shabbat, Friday night, Mefer lele Shabbat, v'yom Shabbat ad shetechshach. He basically has till nightfall of the next day. It's almost 24 hours. Nadra im chashecha, but what if she took the neder just before nightfall on Shabbat afternoon? Mefer ad shelo techshach. He has a very small window in which he can. So that's what we mean, lahakel ulahachmil. And what do you see from here? This goes against the conclusion we just came to. We just came to the conclusion that he has 24 hours. But this Mishnah seems to imply that he only has till nightfall. So what's the obvious answer the Gemara is going to say? Tanaihi, it must be a machloket tanaim. Okay, there's a Tanaitic debate about this. So anytime we say there's a Tana that seems to contradict, we say, oh, there's another Tana that says this, and that kind of resolves it for us. Titania says in the following Braita, Haparat nidarim kol hayom, Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon amru me'ed le'ed. So here you see, it's a subject of debate. Going back to what I mentioned before about there constantly being debates, here we have a debate about the topic. Nishalim lenidarim. Now they have one final question about this. Ibayalehu. Kishalo hayalo pnai, o dilma afilo hayalo pnai. We've come across this before. What if there's something you could have done before and you didn't take care of it? Right? We all know Friday we get very busy and there's lots of things that we don't end up taking care of. Shabbat comes in, all of a sudden you remember all these things you don't take care of. Are you allowed to do something that in general would be permitted, but you could have done it before and you didn't? So is that allowed? So now they say, Tashma, let's learn from here. The rabbis took Rav Zutra, the son of Rabbi Zera, and they matered his neder on Shabbat. Even though it was a situation where there was time, he did have an opportunity to do it the day before. By the way, whenever they say had the opportunity, I always wonder, what does it really mean had the opportunity? Like if you look at my Friday is busy and I don't have a lot of time and I didn't get to everything. Does that mean I had the time because I didn't make the time, right? We all know you don't really think you have the time, but somehow you could have really made the time. Or does it mean that you actually had some free time and you didn't do it? So it's a very good question about what this means. Don't have an answer for it, but it's something to think about. So anyway, they say they let him get rid of his neder, nullify it, even though he did have time to do it previously, and there they have. Now we're going to get to this strange thing. He's now going to explain to us what exactly happened here. A few different interpretations, but let's assume there was an alley, a little passageway between two houses. Vituma haytasham. Now, it wasn't exactly tuma. It was someone was about to die. Now, what happens if someone's about to die? Okay, we end with Tum and Tara. We've discussed this a lot in the Masechet Tum and Tara, although we're not going to actually end on it. We're close to ending on it. Vigigit stuka munachat al gaban. There was a little bit of a roof over this area, and the person was under the roof in between these two houses, and the person was about to die. Now, there's a window leading to the houses. If a person were to die under there and there's a roof, this is what we call tumah made in an ohel. He's under a cover. The tumah spreads through the whole space in the alley, and then it also goes through windows. Now you see why they wanted to stop up the window, because before the person died, they wanted to make sure, right, what happens if the tumah goes in the house, all the utensils in the house become tameh. So they wanted to basically, they wanted to stop the tumah from going. So what they do, they quickly put a vessel in the window to block the tumah from going in. Now, there's another law. If there was a hole apparently in the roofing. So if they wanted to measure if it was a tefach. If it was a tefach, it's a bit of a debate about whether the whole body had to be under the tefach or part of the body, but let's assume the body was under the space. And then if it was a tefach, then we'd say that the tumah goes straight up through the hole, in which case there's no ohel, in which case it won't go through the windows and it won't go into the houses and it won't be a problem at all. So they wanted to know if there was a tefach and if there would be any problem with tumah at all, or the tumah would just go straight up and it wouldn't be a problem. So because of that, they basically allowed them to tie with a reed. Now, why is a reed okay? Because it's not a kesher shel kayama. It doesn't last. So because of that, they allow it to be tied. They allowed them to tie it with a reed. And what they do, they wanted to tie it to the roof to measure. First they measured exactly a tefach, then, which is also a problem. Why is measuring a problem? Measuring is a problem on Shabbat because it's like mekach umemkach. So If you remember with Mekach Umemkar, it's doing business on Shabbat, and measuring is something they generally do in business dealing. So measuring is generally a problem, but we're going to learn now that you can allow it for the purposes of a mitzvah. They call this a mitzvah. Why is it a mitzvah? Because you're saving items from becoming tameh or from becoming impure. Umidivrehem lamanu shepokekin umodedim v'koshlim b'Shabbat. Right, and from there they learned that you can do pokekin, you can put something in a window. We already learned that. That's because it's like most. Remember, if it's hanging from the window, we already learned this whole section. And modedim, you measure, and koshlim, and you can tie b'Shabbat. This presumably means that you did it for the purposes of a mitzvah. Now that they're really quoting this line here, not because it's ending the story, because they figured you already know that, but they're quoting it as the lead into the last story of the Gemara. Interestingly, the Gemara ends with the story. It doesn't always end with the story, but in this Masechet it does. Ula ikla lebei Reish Galuta. Ula comes to the house of the Reish Galuta. He's the exilarch. We've seen this in many situations. The people come to his house. There's always big feasts. There's a lot of wealth. He's a very wealthy person. They go to the Reish Galuta's house. Chazi leRabba bar Rav Huna diyativ ba'avna demaya. He sees Rabba bar Rav Huna, a very strange scene. He sees him sitting in a tub of water. Scene gets a little stranger, and he's measuring the water in the tub. This is strange. Why is he doing this on Shabbat? Why is he doing this in the house of the Reish Galuta? Why is Ula watching him while he's in this tub of water? Amar le, imor da amre Rabbanan, medida de mitzvah. To love mitzvah mi amor. Ula says to him, what are you doing? The rabbis allow measuring, but they only allow measuring for the purposes of a mitzvah. You're just sitting in this tub of water. You're not doing any mitzvah. Why are you measuring the water? Amar le, and here's the fascinating to me, the Masechet ends with these words, mitasek be'alma ana. I'm just playing around in the water with the measuring stick. Not really. I'm not measuring for the sake of measuring. I'm just measuring to keep myself busy. Somebody said that, I read a commentary that said that since you're not allowed to learn Torah, so he needed to focus his attention on something while he was in the bath so that he could, not think of Torah while he was there. Anyway, first of all, why is it interesting? Mitasik, we've talked about this many times, about the idea of intention, and we're going to hear later about the idea of intention. Yafit's going to talk about it. But I wanted to really talk about a few themes that come up at the end of this Masechet. So the first theme I wanted to discuss is the rich-poor theme. We started our Masechet with the idea of the Ani and the Balabayit. If you remember, they were standing, right? The Ani is outside, the Balabayit's inside, and they want to give. And in fact, the Meiri says there that why did the Mishnah start with this? Because they wanted to teach you that even for the sake of a mitzvah, you can't desecrate Shabbat, right? You can't give them, you might think, oh, maybe I could give something to a poor person, even though it's Shabbat. And no, Shabbat is more important. On the other hand, you have, what we learned this morning about tzedakah tatzil mimavet and how important the Masechet ends with how important tzedakah is. And then we have this last story, which happens specifically in a wealthy person's house, right? And we're comparing the wealthy, the poor, the ones who need. And already earlier in today's shiur, I discussed more about the story of tzedakah tatzil mimavet and how important tzedakah was and how they were ignoring, right? They had the walls that were blocking them from seeing what goes on outside. That's one theme. Another theme that I thought came up a lot here was finding solutions. Everything we discussed today is about finding a solution. The woman made a vow and the husband wants to get her out of it. By the way, I also think that the idea of him canceling her vows was to protect her, right? That if she swore to do something that was not in her interest, he could protect her. I think the idea was that the men maybe knew more than the women and we were able to protect them from things that they might make a mistake. I think also women sometimes say things, and there's the idea they're not so careful about it and they just, without really thinking, they might say something. And that's the idea. Again, back in their society, obviously today, I would think it might be quite different. Then we had the situation where they wanted to prevent Tuma. They wanted to find a solution. So not everything was going to become Tameh. So we see that there's attempts to find solutions to problems. But the real thing I wanted to focus on is this last story. Notice the idea here is all about midivrehem lamadnu, that we want to learn from their actions. And we saw all throughout the Masechet about people learning from people's actions. And you see here two stories. One is they saw this action they did with the impurity and they learned from the action. The next story was almost the opposite. You have someone doing something in the exilarch's house, which is a big public space. There's a lot of people there. And here's this rabbi, and he's doing something that looks like it's not correct. And Ula says to him, what are you doing? And I read a commentary also that said that maybe he wouldn't have asked him if he was in his house. He would have known that he must be doing it for an okay purpose. However, because he was in the exilarch's house, and because there were all these people, and because people might misconstrue, he had to put him and ask him, why are you doing this? And it's interesting that Rav Huna wasn't really concerned about that. And I was thinking, we learned a lot of things in the Masechet about Marit Ayin. People might think, and what they and there's always this tension between what you're worried people might think. On the other hand, you should have the confidence that you're doing the right thing, and you shouldn't always worry about what other people are saying. And I think that there's this tension here, and that's the tension they're describing at the end of the Masechet about what you do and how it affects other people. And it might depend on the scenario where you are. And that's why we're told he's in the Reish Galuta's house. You might think that's a non-important detail, but it's very important because where you are, who's around you, who you are. If you're a prominent person, you might have to hold yourself in a different way and act in a different way and hold yourself to a different standard. So all these things, I think, show you, and that's why I like that the Masechet ends with this, is that we all want to know answers. We want to know, how do you do this? I don't know, for many of you who are new to this, I don't know what you expected to find in Gemara, but the Gemara essentially is a book of laws, and you'd expect to find laws and know what to do. And many of you, I'm sure, are struggling with, okay, I learned all of Masechet Shabbat. I still don't know exactly what I'm supposed to do. And the idea is that a lot of the laws are unclear, and it depends on the scenario, and it depends on the situation, depends on who you are, and that's the beauty of the learning, is that there's no clear-cut answers, which sometimes is a frustration. On the other hand, it shows the beauty of the system and how there's always room for other ideas. Okay, for subjectivity, for, if you remember, we learned with muktzah and all sorts of things. If you consider it important, it becomes important, and that's how the Masechet ends. With that, we're going to say the Hadrons, and then we're going to move on to the second part of the program. Hadron alach mishech uslika la Masechet Shabbat. Here we're going to say, I hope you have it all in front of you. Hadron alach Masechet Shabbat v'hadra chalan. Datan alach Masechet Shabbat v'dat hachalan. Lo ninashem minach Masechet Shabbat v'lo titnashem milan. Lo ma'alma haden v'lo ba'alma da'ate. We're going to say this 3 times. This means we want to go back to Masechet Shabbat. We're going to read it again. Okay, you have 7.5 years. We can go back to it. It's always going to be in our minds, and we're never going to forget you. Hadron alach Masechet Shabbat v'hadra chalan. Datan alach Masechet Shabbat v'dat hachalan. Lo ninashem minach Masechet Shabbat v'lo tinashem milan. Lo ba'alma haden v'lo ba'alma da'ate. Hadron alach Masechet Shabbat v'hadra chalan. Datan alach Masechet Shabbat v'dat hachalan. Lo ninashem minach Masechet Shabbat v'lo tinashem milan. Lo ba'alma haden v'lo ba'alma da'ate. Yehi ratzon b'fanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'Elokei avotenu shetehei toratcha u'manutenu ba'olam hazeh. Teimanu la'olam haba. Chanina bar Papa Rami bar Papa Nachman bar Papa Achai bar Papa Abba Mary bar Papa Rafram bar Papa Rachish bar Papa Surcha bar Papa Ada bar Papa Daru bar Papa. Ha'arev na Adonai Eloheinu et divrei toratecha befinu u'fi piyot amcha Beit Yisrael. V'niyeh kulanu anachnu v'tzetzeinu v'tzetzei amcha Beit Yisrael kulanu yodei shemecha v'lomdei toratecha. Me'ovai techachmenu mitzvotecha ki la'olam hili. Yehi libi b'tamim b'chukecha leman lo evosh leman lo ashkach pikudecha ki bam chiyitanu. Baruch ata Adonai lamdeni chukecha. Amen, amen, amen. Sela va'ed. Yehi ratzon lefanecha Adonai Elohai kashem she'azartani l'sayem Masechet Shabbat kein ta'azurenu lahatchil mesechtot isfarim acharim l'saymam ללמוד וללמד, לשמור ולעשות ולקיים את כל דברי תלמוד תורתך באהבה. וזכות כל התנאים והאמוראים ותלמידי חכמים יעמוד לנו ולזרענו שלא ימוש התורה מפי ומפי זרענו וזרע זרענו עד עולם. ותתקיים בנו ותהלכך תנחה אותך בשוכבך תשמור עליך והקיצות היא תשיחך. כי בירבו ימיך ויוסיפו לך שנות חיים, אורך ימים בעינה, בשמאלה עושר וכבוד, Adonai oz la'amo yiten, Adonai yivarech et amo b'shalom.